Welcome to the Great Humbling podcast. I'm Dougal Tyne, and since 2020 I've been recording these conversations with my friend Ed Gillespie. We start where our work meets and the places it takes us, the things that we're reading, the things that are getting us thinking, circling around the thought that these times in which we're living might be a humbling, a time of being brought down to earth and changed by the impact. Thank you for listening. Ed, we're back. Somebody said to me, have you stopped doing the Great Humbling? And I said, I don't think we could if we wanted to. I feel like the Great Humbling is this unfolding process that we're caught within. It's slightly inappropriately to today's episode. It's a kind of vortex that we're caught within that is going to be swirling us around for the rest of our lives. And the only question is how often we bring it to the ears of people on the internet. But we're back. How are you?
I'm good. That's very poetically put. I know what you mean. I definitely get an itch when we are not having our conversations. And as I say, if there was a set outcome or end goal, I would think it'd be a different story. But as you say, this is a ongoing unfolding.
Yes. When we hit the ground, we'll know. But meanwhile, we're still in free fall.
Yes.
Headed groundwards. At varying speed, defying laws of physics. Yeah, I get lovely notes now and then from people. I can't remember who this was, but someone sent me a mail, and she's like, "I listen to you guys in the kitchen, and it feels really personal. This relationship, and it makes me happy to know that there is something apparently sanity-inducing for some fraction of our listeners in these conversations, because there's definitely something sanity-inducing for me in gaming.
Oh yeah, exactly. Maybe we should record an episode whilst in the kitchen, chopping. Do the ultimate hospitality meal preparation that is done over the conversation, because we know that's where a lot of the interesting conversations happen. Not that I'm in the kitchen, obviously.
Well, this is where are you? Just for people who haven't seen this background before, these amazing beams. This is inside the Mill of Impermanence.
Yeah, I'll just say I can actually interact with it because people go, "Is this real? Is this?" It is actually the Mill of Impermanence on the first floor. I'm not yet migrated down into the shed, although that is imminent because it's finally getting warm enough. But during the winter, I kind of snuggle upstairs with a blanket and a hot water bottle on my knee.
I hear you. Yeah. Well, so we're here, and it's April. Is it April? It is still April.
April, just.
Yeah, it's coming up to Walpurgis Night, Valborg, as we call it here in Sweden, or May Eve, as they know it in Oxford and other places in the UK where attention is paid to that moment in the calendar. So it's been a while. I did, at the beginning of April, on April Fool's Day, I did a live thing for resilience.org with Vanessa Andriotti, Machado de Oliveira, delete as applicable, Hospicing Modernity, Vanessa, and it was great. We've done a couple of events together this year. And she said a couple of things that really stuck with me in that. This is sort of apropos of looking back over 2025 so far and major world events, which we don't necessarily need to reiterate, but she said, so before January, whenever she did a talk around hospicing, modernity, and these themes, she could pretty much rely on getting a question from someone going, but hang on a minute, what's the evidence that modernity is dying? And she said, since January, no one asks that question. And that's, one aspect of everything that's going on in the world is that there's a kind of crossing of a threshold where, I don't know, the Overton window has moved, however you want to put it. But basically, the stuff that people are like, oh, are you sure? Or like, actually, the stuff that people quietly come up to you or me and talk to us about, but aren't quite sure that their colleagues are ready to hear about yet, has moved into consensus reality in a new way in terms of this sense of being in a time of unraveling. I mean, I'm curious whether you've had your version of noticing that. I mean, you've had other things going on over the last few months, but yeah, what?
Well, yeah. I mean, certainly. I mean, I have. I mean, just to put it on the record, but I lost my mother in February, so that's one of the reasons why we've been delayed in recording another episode of the podcast, and obviously that's been a difficult transition for me in terms of dealing with that loss. But I think what I've been seeing and hearing, and particularly in terms of that unraveling piece, is this newfound like honesty around the uncertainty of what's next. As the acknowledgement that things aren't working and that things are starting to sort of fracture and fragment a little more. You've seen a kind of awareness emerge where people are going, actually, a lot of this stuff is quite broken. And we did a really powerful session with our mutual friend, Sam Conniff, at the Forward Institute on his sort of uncertainty experts. And I think that encapsulates a lot of the challenge that we see in front of us right now, because as Sam says, you can't fix uncertainty. It's a part of life. And I think historically, then we were all in or the people I work with, these senior leaders, they're all in planning, execution, predict, analyze, and then act. And that sort of started to come up against the buffers and going, I don't know what to do next. I'm actually in this weird moment where I'm confronted by an uncertainty I don't know how to navigate. And I think, Sam does a brilliant job of helping taking people through this. But, weirdly, people prefer pain to uncertainty. They'll carry on with the kind of the status quo rather than embrace the uncertainty of what's next. And I think that's a really visceral thing that is going on right now.
Yes. Sam and Catherine, his other half, were here a couple of years ago, and they interviewed me for a podcast project, which I don't know if it's come to fruition yet, actually, but I hope that, it felt like quite a fertile thing. It was a kind of podcast extension of the uncertainty work they're doing. And one of the questions Sam asked me, which I didn't really know how to answer, was, why do you think you seem to be at home with uncertainty? And and he talked to me about some of the things he'd noticed in my work over the years that were part of why he saw me that way. I haven't really thought about it, but that thing of people, I think I prefer uncertainty to pain. And I can't actually tell you why. It might just be a constitutional thing. But it's good to be reminded that that's weird.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think as a consequence of our work that we do, which is slightly atypical, we would have perhaps a more innate level of high uncertainty tolerance, which is what, Sam describes. So you and I think, have a high tolerance for uncertainty. That's just where we operate. And what the evidence all shows on that is that means you have a greater degree of self-belief, of empathy. You're better at some of the problem solving and decision making. You're better at finding different perspectives, and being self-efficacious, and effective in what you choose to do. So as opposed to what happens when you have low uncertainty tolerance, which is, self-doubt, indecision, exhaustion, closed-mindedness, risk aversion, and isolationism, all of those kind of things. And I think uncertainty is actually really fertile, because it is those new possibilities and it is those new potentialities, even in the context of what might seem like a dark horizon.
And this is so something that's kind of coming to mind for me. I did a lecture on Friday last week online for the University of Southern Mississippi for their Philosophy and Religion Forum. And I got a great question afterwards from a friend of this podcast, Alison in Wales, who so I'd been talking about belief. The theme of the lecture was who believes in climate change. And I'll write this up and put it on Substack quite soon. But she said, she asked about the relationship between belief and not knowing. And it brought something into focus for me, which is I think that in modernity, belief has come to be mapped very closely to certainty. Your beliefs have become a set of things you can't prove, but you're certain about, which is really, really weird, historically speaking. And
I'm sorry, we will come on to this in a minute, but I just wanted to note that in the Techno-utopian manifesto by Mark Andreessen, someone pointed out that they use the words "we believe" 113 times in that manifesto.
Right.
What does that say to you?
Well, that's really, really interesting. I'm looking forward to what you're going to say about that, because this has been very much on my mind. And I wonder if I'll have to ask Sam and Catherine this next time that I see them, but whether part of the tolerance for uncertainty or lack of tolerance for it is to do with a mapping of certainty to meaning. But this thing where I'm saying that belief and certainty have got bound together in a way that doesn't necessarily make that much sense might produce a sense that uncertainty equals meaninglessness. Whereas there is for me, it's possible I wrote this years ago in an essay about John Berger that part of what I loved from his way of describing the sort of folk metaphysics of his peasant neighbors in the Haute-Savoie was you get this sense of what it is like to cohabit with mystery rather than see mystery as something to be conquered, rather than the unknown being something that we will one day know or that's not real. You have this zone of that which is real, but beyond the limits of our kind of knowing. And that always seems a lot saner to me. But that's part of what I'm saying is it's getting quite abstract. But what I think gets edged out, which produces this idea of belief as asserted certainties in modernity. So,
well, I think on two things on that. I think what you describe, I think when you have low uncertainty tolerance, I think uncertainty can feel like meaninglessness. Because you're uncomfortable with it. You're like, oh, well, hang on, where's the frame? Where's the focus here? Whereas I think, I'm also slightly suspicious of people who are really certain about stuff. I've talked before on this podcast, about the sort of, the solutionists approach. It's like, we've got all the answers. It's like, have we? And are those the answers to the right questions? So, I think certainty, perhaps I have lower tolerance for certainty.
Well, certainty's not very humble, really, is it?
No.
So, Ed, I know we have our traditional question, and I also, in the course of 4 months, it's absurd the amount of stuff that we're going to have read and listened to. But I happen to know one thing that you watched on Friday night. I happen to know that you spent your Friday night watching Sean Connery run around in a red leather mankini. Is there any truth in this allegation? How do you defend yourself?
How I spend every Friday night. No, I have only you to blame, my dear. When we were discussing in advance what we might talk about today, and you said, I'd like to talk about this book Against the Vortex, which is obviously inspired as a response to a John Borman 1974 classic, Zardos, which I'd never seen, but I had obviously, through various research means, come across the aforementioned image of Sean in his red leather mankini, because it's quite iconic. But I'd never actually got round to watching the film. And I mean, I have to say,
what did you make of it? It's mad, isn't it?
It's totally mad. I mean, just that opening sequence with the giant floating head in the sky, like booming out, the gun is good, the penis is evil, we must cleanse the brutes. And I was like slightly wide-eyed on the sofa. And this was Friday afternoon, before I went to pick up my daughter from school. So it wasn't even a kind of, by night viewing experience. It was in the cold, bright sunlight of day. And I was kind of blown away by it conceptually. I think it's when you see these slightly dystopian film visions from the mid-70s, obviously when we were tiny. I mean, I was 2 years old when this film was made, so it's half a century ago. And I was really struck by, some of the sort of prescience, the role of the tabernacle and the ring, and the kind of, it felt like them talking to Chat GPT.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of things. I mean, for people who haven't seen it, so you have this kind of, it's the Vortex is the name, isn't it, of the sort of lifeboat community of this elite. I mean, it's got a bit of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine going on. The sort of humanity has forked into these two groups, but then there's also a kind of decadence of the elite who have achieved some kind of immortality in the post-collapse Vortex bubble.
Yeah, well, I wrote down one of the quotes. He said, "The world was dying. We took all the good and made an oasis."
Yeah.
I want to say, well, that's very magnanimous of you. Thank you very much indeed for that. But in terms of the uncertainty, they also said, we are custodians of the past for an unknown future. And you are the price we pay, i.e. the outlanders, the brutes, the monsters, this kind of savage humanity that is left beyond the Vortex. So, I mean, in terms of those classic pieces of work where you can see where things might go, I thought it was really powerful. I mean, apparently it was met with a lot of confusion on its initial release. And they crowbarred in that weird sort of preamble at the beginning where
that's right. Yes.
sort of try and explain it.
Yes.
When this sort of talking head pops up, and you're like, what's this? And apparently that was to try and help people make sense of it, because
the test audience has been so baffled.
Yeah. And there's something really telling now, watching it 50 years hence, where we're so familiar with the notion of sci-fi dystopia, because there's such a rich cultural seam of this, that actually, you come at it and go, oh yeah, I know where this is going, and I can see how these tensions are playing out. It's the way that Sean Connery is like this savage brute, and that death can come in many forms, and he's there sort of dispatching and executing people left, right, and center, and and all of that. But it's like, I still had this sort of Borat image in my head that was bringing a sort of weird satirical comedy edge to it. I couldn't quite take it seriously.
And you have to just kind of roll with the kitsch absurdity and the possibility that there's, and this is what Anthony Gallerzo does so well in Against the Vortex, which I really recommend. It's a short, sharp book that he wrote during the pandemic, sort of riffing around Zardos as a way into both thinking about where we find ourselves now and recovering a neglected current within sort of 70s environmental thinking and counterculture, what he calls critical Aquarianism. And some of this is, I mean, I think Anthony's on a similar project to some of the conversation that we've been having over the years on this podcast. And I'd say also, friends of this podcast, Elias and Pete, who do the Lost Prophets podcast, which is actually kind of going through, mostly sort of zooming in on particular thinkers from this era. And the way Anthony says is, there is a counterculture tradition, an intellectual tradition within that is neither the sort of therapeutic self-centeredness that is the kind of, the Century of the Self documentary did a good job of telling the story of the extent to which the 60s and 70s counterculture veered into that direction. So it's a true current within it, but it's not the whole story. Nor the hippie modernist cult of technology, which is, we talked about this in the first series when we talked about Stuart Brand and the whole Earth catalogue and that. And what Anthony's pointing to is that alongside or in between or off to the side of those two currents emerging from that moment, there's something else which is represented by, by thinkers like Illich, among others. And obviously he's the one who's kind of closest to my heart, and Anthony would relate it as well to early James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, and that being also part of this, he calls it critical Aquarianism. But I mean, there's more to say about that, but it is also just worth dwelling on the enjoyable weirdness and absurdity of the film. And
well, I mean, I know this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but when we had the Zardos origin from the conflation and portmanteau of Wizard of Oz,
yes,
and it's obviously all about the person or the entity or the world behind the mask. I mean, I thought that was kind of a genius moment. I was like, okay, this is fantastic. Now I'm completely engaged. But I mean, I also felt it had sort of shades of Ursula K. Le Guin, and the ones who walk away from Omelos, as we've talked
yes.
about before, because it was almost like those in the Vortex had to deny the reality of the outland that existed beyond, because it was only their isolation and secretionism of taking themselves apart from that enabled them to live this, as you say, slightly decadent, although sexless life. I mean, that did seem to be a rather unnecessarily boring part of it.
Well, this is so the other thing that, and I wrote to Anthony after I'd read his book and said this. I think the other interesting connection that's worth making is between Borman's Zed, which is the Sean Connery character in Hair, and John Berger's G. It came out a year or so before Borman made the film, won the Booker Prize, caused a lot of controversy. And G is also a sort of central character who is frankly, priapic, phallocentric, revolutionary figure whose name is a single letter, G, Z. And the other bit, the bit that actually made me make the connection, and this is why you're okay to sort of drop the spoilers in, is because there is a fundamental non-linearity to Zardos. Like it's even in the cinematography of it, it's this kind of, everything's kind of fragmented and reflected in mirrors and through prisms, and it's got this kind of cubist aesthetic to it, which is exactly how Berger was writing when he wrote G, which is actually like one of my least favorite of his books. I don't think John Berger gets interesting until after he wrote G and Ways of Seeing, the two books he's best known for in many ways. And then when he settled in the Haute Savoir, I think then he's changed by that experience and he becomes the writer who I absolutely love and who formed me. But nonetheless, G and Zardos belong alongside each other. And then also, actually, there's a film that Berger wrote the script for called For Jonah, Who Will Be 25 in the Year 2000. That's a few years after Zardos, but that's also kind of, it's sort of about the ebbing of the tide of that critical Aquarian side of the counterculture. It's 8 characters in the aftermath of the failure of the hopes of 68 and the sort of back to the land movement and so on, trying to make sense of their lives. It's a very interesting film. But so, yeah, it does all of this kind of teleports us into this moment that is 50 years ago that we're too young to remember, but that feels, in some ways, and I think Anthony makes the case for this in his book, very relevant to now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's the thing. As I said, it's got the echoes of Omelos and the kind of a land or a world that's built on lies and suffering. Hello modernity. That kind of inevitability of Western industrial, scientific and technological development. That sort of progress argument, progress at all costs. There's also sort of notion of Promethean growth, beyond all limits. So it's obviously a limitless world, and I found all of those themes, very recognizable. And obviously 50 years ago, they probably would have felt quite prescient. I mean, you're only 2 years out from, the Club of Rome in 1972. So it's quite a radical perspective, which asks some very big questions, even through some of the sort of slightly psychedelic, prismatic effects, particularly towards the end of the film, where you're like, I'm glad I'm watching this during the day and not after a couple of drinks late at night, because I'm sure it would be influencing my dreams in unforetold ways.
Yes. Well, I mean, and so this is just a line from Anthony's book that kind of sums up why he thinks the question that Zardos is asking continues to be so relevant. He says it's, what these critical Aquarian thinkers were really asking is how to exit the dead end of industrial modernism and its legitimating fictions, utilitarianism, Prometheanism, productivism, and its ecocidal dreams of endless growth, secular immortality, and total control, in the face of interrelated material, ecological, and spiritual crises, without sliding into a reactionary anti-modernism. And I mean, that's not a bad description for many of the themes that have been running through our conversations over the last 5 years, frankly, is it?
No, and distilled neatly into one
One long
well-articulated
sentence.
paragraph.
Yeah. And so the other bit that's interesting to me, which again is a theme that we've talked about, and it's something that I touched on in At Work in the Ruins, is these kind of genealogies of green politics, retellings of the story of the different currents and kind of shibboleths and dividing lines within the history of environmentalism and environmental politics. And that comes up. That's part of what Anthony is doing in lifting up these critical Aquarians, is he's putting them on one side of a line, and on the other side of it, he's putting the kind of technocratic, expert-centered version of environmentalism, including Stuart Brand, including neo-Malthusian population politics. And I found that interesting because around the same time that I'd read the book and been watching that film, which now has printed this image that will never leave my. I'm scarred for life by the image of Sean in his red mankini. But I was also reading a very interesting, provocative paper by Stephen Quilly called "Ecology After Virtue and After Modernity." So after Virtue, obviously, Alistair McIntyre is there in the mix. Carl Polanyi is also in the mix. And Stephen's asking some probing questions about why there has been this tendency to assume that taking our ecological predicament seriously is somehow compatible with the entitlements of liberal, individualistic, late modernity. And I think it's a really important set of questions that he's asking, and I'm kind of keen to bring his voice more into the mix and actually try and bring these kinds of conservative thinkers who are asking these questions into dialogue with the kind of decolonial critique of modernity that a book like Hospicing Modernity represents, as uncomfortable as that mix might get. But what struck me was he has a bit within that paper that's actually the section heading is Genealogy of Green Politics. And the difference is in his version, the neo-Malthusians are on one side of the line and the kind of tech solutionists are on the other side of the line. And I don't think I can unfold fully what happens when you put that into play with this other mapping that Anthony Galuzzo is offering. I think I just want to say those two things, that short book Against the Vortex and that paper Ecology After Virtue and After Modernity, I think it will be useful for a few of us to read those alongside each other and just see what comes into view from these two different ways of mapping the sort of, the currents within environmentalism.
I mean, absolutely. But particularly when you look at what's being argued on the other side, which is, as I referenced earlier, Mark Andreessen's, techno Techno-optimist manifesto.
But tell us more about this, because I've heard various references to it. I'm afraid I haven't
Yeah.
sat down and
I
read
mean,
113 belief statements.
so Mark Andreessen, and I think he created Netscape Navigator, so he was a very early stage internet entrepreneur, made a ton of money. Another one of those billionaires. He's sort of taken the effective altruism movement, made infamous by Sam Bankman-Fried, now being held at US government
Asset
pleasure.
bank and locked up.
Yes, exactly. So, but they've taken basically that effective altruism and turned it into, well, for want of a better word, effective accelerationism.
Mhm.
It's like, it's a really radical manifesto for technology without constraint, and saying that that is the key to unlocking progress, wealth, and happiness. So in a way, effective altruism was about making money to give it away, to give it in a way, in a charitable and philanthropic fashion, which is still questionable, because it's like, well, who gives you the right to, decide how that money might be spent or invested? So effective accelerationism sort of does away with that, even. It says, we just want to make money and put it all in tech, because that's where the answers are going to come from. And his argument essentially goes that a strong society depends on economic growth, depends on technology through free markets. And actually, the best thing we should all be doing is throwing everything at technological resolutions. I mean, it's sort of terrifying as you read it, because you're going, I can't remember. I think it's an Ursula K. Le Guin quote. I dug it out earlier because I just thought that would be, we've talked about this theme before, but Ursula K. Le Guin said, progress is the idea that we can escape the consequences of our actions. And that was just sort of going through my head all the way through the Techno-optimism. But it's like going, what do you mean there's been no bad outcomes out of all of this? And it gets a bit worse, because actually it also makes kind of a homage reference to the 1909 Manifesto of Futurism by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, which, who then wrote the Fascist Manifesto. So, what could possibly go wrong when you've got a techno-optimist who's like flirting with fascism? And he's even paraphrased one of Marinetti's famous quotes, which is like, beauty only exists in struggle. There is no masterpiece that has not got an aggressive character. Technology must be a violent assault on the forces of the unknown to force them to bow before man. And you're like, okay.
And there we go. We're back to this question of, cohabiting with the unknown or conquering the unknown.
Conquering the unknown, exactly. Defeating it.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, even before you brought up the Marinetti bit, because I actually don't know. I haven't checked this out. Where does Mark Andreessen fall within the kind of the transformed or revealed landscape of Silicon Valley in the era of Trump Mark II? I mean, is he fully like in with Peter Thiel's gay space fascism?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is. I think,
Right.
He's like Musk. He's like a former Democrat turned Trumpian, because of, I think, a quite visceral knee-jerk reaction to the increasing regulation that was coming into the technology and the Silicon Valley space, and seeing that as being completely anti their own interests, not least within the kind of regulation of emerging AI as well. What they I think believe in is this sort of techno capital singularity, which again, sort of sends shivers down my spine. The American journalist from Gawker, Elizabeth Spires, she put it brilliantly. She goes, the manifesto has the pathos of the Unabomber, but lacks the ideological coherency.
Well,
so it's a really uncomfortable read, because it's sort of, on one level it's vaguely credible, but another level it's sort of batshit crazy. And it works through so many different elements of life. But yes, it is with sort of Peter Thiel's gay space fascism.
Well,
which, actually Zardos has a bit of that.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we'll have to. I'll drop a link into the show notes to. There was a great essay that defined this term, gay space fascism. For those who are not yet familiar with it, it's very revealing of this current within the new version of the Trump regime.
There's also a lovely sort of counter paper, which actually is what came out from our hard art gang.
Oh, right.
Co-authored by Indy Johar. I don't know if you know Indy.
Oh, I know Indy of old.
Of
Yeah,
course
yeah.
you do.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, we've all been in this space. I've known Indy a very long time. With David Johnston, he's written a piece which is called Hard Imagination, which, if you like, is like the response to the Techno-optimist manifesto, and it's very much flagging all of the things that would be ringing alarm bells, which is this rapid technological advancement, this corporatization, this hyper financialization, and all of that bioengineered, augmented reality that's machine driven. And without sort of flinching away from that, it's actually set out a stall to say, really, this is a moment for the collective imagination that can center planetary consciousness, that can emphasize systemic circularity, and to be about the rehumanization of society. So it's very idealistic, but
Mm.
it's actually confronting Mark Andreessen's arguments head on and saying, yeah, no, but, look over here. What
Right.
you're arguing is actually going to be sort of nightmarish.
All right. I'm going to have a look at that because, yeah, it sounds like there'd be lots of interesting questions to ask about it. But uh, the kind of neat segue here is you were talking about effective acceleration, and that's a subject that has been on my mind because one of the defining experiences of recent weeks in our household has been what happened with our car. Now,
What happened to your car, Dougal?
uh, I feel like I'm lying on the couch now.
Well, you are on a chaise longue. I mean, you wouldn't have to lie back very far.
So I mean, this is the bit. This is the bit where the Great Humbling goes top gear, and I do the review of the 2016 Volkswagen Passat GTE, how it's holding up after
Does your
eight.
car have a name? Have you anthropomorphized your car?
No, I'm afraid that my animism doesn't has not. Maybe that's the explanation.
Feels
Maybe
unloved.
maybe our car was just feeling unloved. But basically, when we bought this house and moved from Västerås out to Östervåla, um, Anna was still working back in Västerås, and it's 60 miles away, and there's no direct public transport connection. So for the first time in our lives, really, we um, took ownership of a car, and we bought this. I don't even know what this is. Funny, these things that I have the Swedish vocabulary for because they've only been part of my life in Sweden. A chargeable hybrid, I guess, would be the English expression for it.
And what is that in Swedish? Just for the benefit of our ears.
Lad hybrid. Um, but there you go. It's a lad car. It's a lad car, Ed. It's not. It's a very family-ish car. And just over a week ago, so we bought this. We bought it secondhand. It was about 4 years old. We've had it for about 4.5 years. It's got about 65,000 miles on the clock, and just over a week ago, not even a red light, an orange light started flashing on the dashboard that said, well, it went through like a sequence of orange lights, one of which referred to the gearbox, and then it's referred to the hybrid system, and it said, take it to the garage, and we obeyed.
Take me to your leader immediately.
Yeah. Um, and then the car's in Anna's name. She came back from work last Tuesday and she'd had a call from the man at the garage. And she said, I've got very bad news about the car. And so the man at the garage had called and he said, it's the gearbox. Now, Ed, would you like to hazard a guess at how much a replacement gearbox for a 2016 Volkswagen chargeable hybrid car, lad hybrid car is?
500 euros.
Uh, in Swedish krona, 100,000 of your Swedish krona, which is about 10,000 euros.
10. Wow.
10,000 euros. And I
10,000 euros.
did a little bit of reading around online around it. And I fear that we have,
Ow.
I fear that we've been driving around in a metaphor for collapse. Because uh, the the wonderful engineers at Volkswagen created an incredibly complex system that is working with these two different, the electric and the petrol motors and all of this. And the upshot of that complexity is that, well, a gearbox shouldn't be giving out after 65,000 miles anyway, but B, that it's become an order of magnitude more complex and more expensive and beyond repair. And it's just, I mean, boggling.
It's it's back to Ursula K. Le Guin, isn't it?
Uh,
You're not escaping the consequences of that complexity. In fact, you're reaping them.
And I fear that the gearbox of our car is a metaphor for the way that we have been trying to respond to the climate crisis, Ed. I fear that this is, this is the dead end of industrial modernity, writ small. It's because by chance, the week that the gearbox of our car gave up the ghost, I noticed that John Michael Greer had returned after many years to the themes of the Archdruid report. So he's basically been on a sort of 8-year detour through writing about all kinds of other things. And then last week he came back with a new essay at Ecosophia, where he publishes essays most weeks. And it's like, yeah, it's time to return to the things I was writing about 20 years ago when I started writing publicly. And so he started with this kind of tour back through the the landscape of collapse this much further into it. And it's like, the defining thing of this is that progress, like everything else, has diminishing returns. And he said we're well into the downside of that law of diminishing returns, the point at which each new tranche of technology yields negative results. He said, where the scariest word in the English language has become upgrade. And it's certainly an interesting counter to Mark Andreessen, but I think it probably fits the experience of what it's like to inhabit this society rather better than the techno-optimism of Andreessen. Anyway, that's just...
Well, I want you to do. So is the car now going
It's sat at the garage. The garage and the insurance company are talking to each other. We're waiting to see what becomes, in what way the situation is salvaged. I mean, it reveals to us also that we're in this kind of privileged marginal position where actually in practice now our lives are not day-to-day car dependent. So we can live for a while without a car while all of this resolves. And it also, it takes me back to lean logic and David Fleming and his thing of, we talk about how the world has enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. But it's actually our needs, the things we've become dependent upon, that make it so hard to find, a way out of the fix that we're in. Because most people are, many people are dependent on cars in ways that we're not quite in this family.
I want you to drive the car on its final journey to North Suffolk and to Cove Hive and to park it in the shell of the church. as a kind of piece of situationist art, so we can place the car that embodies collapse within the degrowth church.
I love it. We have to paint something on the bonnet like the KLF, the K Foundation.
Well, and also it's conveniently close to a cliff that you could drive it off. I really wanted to ram the metaphor home because it's a crumbling coastline as well.
I think probably dumping a car in the sea is a bit off-brand for the Great Humbling. But the funny thing, since you mentioned the idea of driving it across Europe literally last week, in the middle of dealing with all of this, my dear friends Philip and Monica Baldwin and Guggisberg, the glass artists who I did a book with around the time we were doing our first series, they were here because they had a new exhibition opening in Stockholm, and they came up for lunch just to hang out and chat about everything. And they had driven in their 22-year-old Volkswagen Polo from Wales to here. And they were like, yeah, we've had this car 22 years. And yeah, we had to change the gearbox once, but it wasn't that expensive. And
10,000 euros.
yeah, it certainly was nothing like that. And yeah, this is a living example of the point that Greer was laboring in last week's post. So, yes. Ah,
Amazing. Amazing. I mean,
listeners of The Great Humbling who know more about cars than me and Ed, open to advice on what the hell we should do in terms of we probably do need a vehicle around the place for a while longer. But anyway, Ed, over to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think how to kind of respond to that. I mean, I've always thought like the messy notion of the hybrid is an unnecessary complexity. You know, it's like you either could do one thing or the other. You either do the conventional internal combustion engine, which I've still got, you know, a tiny Fiat, which I was like you. Didn't have a car for 25 years in London, and then had to have one for rural life. And I'm denied about going for an electric vehicle, and ended up buying a 10-year-old tiny Fiat because I figured that had the smallest fuel consumption and had already gone a long way to offsetting its own sort of production emissions. But yeah, I'm trying to think about what other examples of that kind of completely unnecessary interstitial complexity are out there, you know, beyond your beloved hybrid car.
Apart from everything.
Apart from everything, yeah, maybe it just is that. Exactly.
I mean, this is kind of Joseph Tainter's theory of the collapse of complex societies. That what happens is complexity gets layered on complexity gets layered on complexity, and that's how you end up steering into the crash rather than steering away from it, or whichever it is that you're meant to do.
Well, yeah. I mean, and that comes back to the decelerationism that we talked about a couple of episodes ago, you know, that is, I think, implicit in so much of this, because, you know, that dash to hybrid, the dash to electric vehicles, you know, the Techno-optimist manifesto is all about trying to make everything go faster. And, you know, I said to you beforehand, I came across an Illich quote when I was working on thinking about what we were going to talk about today, but he said, the faster we move, the less we are free. And I think that's the terrible bit. You're caught in a kind of a mundane domestic trap of, you know, the arcane complexity of your car's gearbox and the impossible price of replacement. But, you know, it feels like we're accelerating into further scenarios like that systemically. Right. And the way that those scenarios will then unfold will mean authoritarianism or a greater degree of totalitarianism, or some kind of, you know, digital panopticon, which is what seems to be unfolding stateside, where, you know, the Silicon Valley Young Turks, who are now combining data across all aspects of US government, and this is not conspiratorial because it's happening, but you know, it's like, we're already seeing people being arrested at borders because of things they might have said about Trump on social media, in which case, you know, I'm never going to America.
Yeah. And I mean, this has been going on for a while. Like, I can remember going to Palestine in 2019 and being really like warned before going about, you know, your social media is going to be searched by the Israeli border control when you arrive in Tel Aviv. And that was...
and obviously it can be done so much more quickly now. It's not like it's a difficult thing to do, you know.
Yes.
You set your AI bot on it and you get an answer in 2 seconds.
Yeah, exactly. So there's something in all of this which leads me to the last bit that I wanted to bring to the table today. I know you've probably got one or two other things as well, but there was a piece by Rob Harrison Plasto,
Mm.
which I think he originally posted on LinkedIn, and then I saw it because it got picked up on resilience.org. And the title sums it up very well. Why well-off Brits who think collapse is coming stay silent. And it's a pretty convincing sketch, and he's hoping that they'll be able to kind of put together more detailed research that will back this up. But I think as a read of the signs of the times, it rings true of the just how widespread the kind of the collapsonomics, brokenism, however you want to put it, worldview quietly is within educated middle class Britain, let's say. And that part of the piece I found completely persuasive. It rings true to the sort of analysis from which I'm working from in the new book that I've started to work on this year. And I mean, it implicit in it is something which you will have heard our mutual friend Brian quote repeatedly, which is the Alexa Yurchak line from Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, where he says, revolutions happen in two stages. First, when everyone stops believing in the existing system. And then second, stage two is when everyone realizes that everyone else has stopped believing in it.
Yeah, it's a bit like Hemingway's bankruptcy, isn't it? How did you go bankrupt?
Yeah, it is a bit like
gradually, then suddenly.
Exactly. The bit that I'm not sure about from Rob's article is, what is it that if everybody notices that everybody else has stopped believing in it, everyone then collectively does? He says, we're now at a tipping point where a large number of people have been activated to the dire state of things when it comes to our many crises and challenges, but their behaviors are not commensurate with their understanding. And to me, the bit that's kind of undersold in there or glossed over is, what would behaviors commensurate with our understanding look like? Because electric cars doesn't cover it. And this is where we're slightly back to, this is why I have a lot of respect for the kind of difficult questions that Steve Quilley is asking. And this kind of, why does everyone talk as if the kind of the entitlements of liberal late modernity should somehow be compatible with the implications of our ecological crisis? Because there's pretty much zero evidence that they are, unless you want to buy into a kind of eco-modernist green tech fix solutionism, which we know doesn't ring true.
Yeah, and I've spoken a couple of times with Rob, so I understand why you've zeroed in on that. I mean, I agree. I'm not sure.
I don't know what he would say to this because I don't know him. But
no, and I mean, firstly, I'm not sure there is, a set of actions which would be commensurate with that understanding. It comes back to how we opened this episode in the discussion around uncertainty. It's what oh God, I forget her name now. Joanna Macy. How can I forget Joanna Macy's name? But it's like she talks about holding actions, doesn't she? And space holding actions. And I always think of Jonathan Franzen stuff around, what do we do when we stop pretending? And his is not a sort of fatalistic hopelessness either. It's more about acting to protect, what you love and care about in your immediate sphere of influence. So I wonder how visible the actions that might be commensurate with that knowledge might be, because they might not be visible at a kind of, at a national or clearly defined level, but they might be already happening at all sorts of like family and local type level.
Yeah, I think we basically agree on that. I have to just pick you up on the Jonathan Franzen thing, because what do you do after you stop pretending was the line that I wrote in 2010 and that got picked up in loads of places. Debbie Danowski, Bruno Latour. Jonathan Franzen wrote a piece called What If We Stop Pretending? And I talked about this in last week's lecture, actually. He leaves out the two most important words from the original version, which are do and after. And I'm afraid, and this will come out in the essay version of the lecture, that I go to town a bit on Franson and what he embodies as representing the people for whom it's hardest to imagine an after in which you're capable of doing anything. But yeah, more generally, yes. Well, this is something. This loops back to the session I did with Vanessa for resilience, because the other thing that really stuck with me that she said was she said, looking around in North America at how people are responding to all of the the unfolding horror show and cruelty and the rest of it of Trump too. She said there is a kind of entitlement, or this was the phrase. In fact, I wrote it down. Inflated sense of agency. She said there's an inflated sense of agency that animates the kind of responses and the kinds of activism that tend to emerge from the global north, that looks weird from the perspective of, coming from Brazil, coming from the global south. And she said in the discussion at Resilience, she said, well, maybe we could call it like the pedestal mode of agency versus the mycelial mode of agency, which is a, humus, humble level of agency. And so it's like our first response to the trouble we're in, whether it's regimes that we rightly feel a desire to resist, or whether it's the oncoming climate crisis, is born out of an idea of agency that's not fit for purpose, that has a kind of infantile sense of entitlement. And I'm being really savage here, but this is kind of what I heard in what Vanessa was saying, a sort of infantile sense of being a toddler having a tantrum. And it's like, fine, be like, we all have the toddler inside ourselves. We need to feel that. We need to let that come through. And then we need to arrive at a place from which a kind of agency that doesn't involve kidding ourselves might emerge. And that's what you do after you stop pretending. And the other bit that's been with me lately, and I think I heard a version of this from Wendell Berry from his most recent book, but I'm sure it's been said in similar ways by different people from different times and places. But it was this. It was, there is an asymmetry when it comes to resistance. And it looks like this. When hate hates love, it's true to itself. When love hates hate, it betrays itself.
Mm.
And in terms of like finding the right kind of agency, particularly in a time when there's a lot of hate animating a lot of what's going on in the world. Not thinking that love hating hate can solve anything is a part of the conundrum. Working out what the loving moves look like within a sense of agency that is not kidding itself. Maybe that's like this far into 2025, the thing that's worth trying to meet around the table around, and maybe it involves a fair bit of sitting in silence and waiting until something comes that's worth saying.
I can't think of a better note to end on.
All right. Ed, it's been great. I'm really, really glad that we got together again. And we're going to do this now. We're going to try and go with the seasons. So we'll try and do 3 more episodes roughly every quarter.
This is the humbling spring.
The humbling spring. There we are. You've been humbled. Thanks for listening to the Great Humbling podcast. You can find more at our website, homewardbound.org, where you can also subscribe to us on Substack. We're on Facebook as The Great Humbling. Ed is, I believe, still on the site formerly known as Twitter as @FruCall. And if you'd like to spend more time with my work, then visit aschoolcalledhome.org and find out about the online series that we're hosting there. The title music for the podcast comes from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks again for listening.